Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this Theology Thursday talk. My name is Naomi. I am one of the Faith and Action project workers here at SCN.
And I'm Grace. I'm the other Faith and Action project worker at SCN.
And we are delighted today to have with us Mthr Erin Clark, who is the Rector of St Matthew's Church in Bethnal Green in East London. Hello to you, Erin. How are you doing today?
Oh, yes. I am delighted to be here.
Amazing. We are delighted to have you. On a personal note, I should say Mthr Erin was my old priest when I used to live in London. So it's great that I can use my job to interrogate her a little bit. So and you will.
Gorilla priest. It's a time-honored tradition. Yes.
So the theme of the talk today is entitled Finding the Divine on the Pavement, which is inspired by Mthr Erin's book, Sacred Pavement, which I have a copy here, which is her 2021 book, all about, it's called Sacred Pavement, a do-it-yourself guide to spirituality in the city. So before we get into that, I just thought it'd be good for us to just know a little bit more about you, Mthr Erin, talk about who you are and how you ended up at St Matthew's.
Yeah, I am, as you can tell, not from around these parts. I grew up in the States, and then during my time at university, wound up moving over to the UK, which I thought was going to be for a short little while for some work that I was doing. And then a few years later, lo and behold, I had a dog collar on my throat. So, God has a sense of humor. And then, yes, after I did my training/retraining as a vicar, I wound up here at St Matthew's, and I've been here for 7 years now. So it's been a bit of a wild ride, but I love this community. I love being able to be part of it in this way. As you know, I'm also a writer and have various different kind of creative writing side projects going at all times, probably far too many going at all times. Yeah, that's me really. I'm also, a dog owner and may have to jump off screen to manage dog, but I will try not to.
That's absolutely fine. I mean, if we do get some dog, then I'm sure that will increase our viewers as well. So that's great. Yeah.
All right. So can you tell us a little bit more about St. Matthew's Bethnal Green and your work there? Because we are part of the Faith and Action project. So I guess we want to ask you a bit about what faith and action means to you and what role does St. Matthew's play in your local community?
Yeah. St. Matthew's is, that kind of funny thing of being both a really typical Church of England parish church and also really weird parish church. It's typical in that faith and action, I think, for a good chunk of our folks here, just means living out their faith in everyday life, finding a way to try and make the world look a little bit more like God's kingdom, whether they're working or caring or volunteering or going down to the laundromat or whatever they're doing. But it's also, we're a member of Inclusive Church and have been for more years than I've been here, kind of a rainbow flag waving congregation. Not so much a kind of church of campaigns, but certainly a church where people feel drawn, who feel strongly about inclusivity across all sorts of areas of human identity and human life. So that's really lovely. I love both of those things, the real kind of like neighborhood aspect to it and the inclusivity aspect to it. We're in the kind of liberal Catholic sacramental wing of the church. So a lot of our life together is centered around the sacraments. So celebrating communion together and making sure that people know that they're always invited towards baptism or confirmation. And it's a lot of learning and thinking, and we've been having lots of processions this last year. So thinking about faith and action as walking, which I think is, we'll talk a little bit about later, but it's been a great way to get people up and about and thinking about what their faith might look like outside the four walls of their house or the four walls of the church.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, is when I was at St Matthew's, I definitely agree with that. It's such a vibrant church as well. But also, I think what I love about it is it was so rooted in the local community, and it was focused on the issues within the local community, which I think it's what a parish church has to be. It has to be sort of, being a visible presence within the community in that way. Um, yeah, and the processions. I just had a flashback to maybe, I think, watching a Corpus Christi procession you did,
Yeah.
which was spectacular. I think camp might be the word for
Yeah,
it.
yeah, definitely. That's had a lot of really amazing ripple effects in terms of the local community going, oh, you guys are still, you're still going as a church, you're still doing things, had so many conversations with our local Muslim neighbors that are like, it's so good to see you Christians out and about, so it's had a sort of interfaith connection angle, which was really amazing, especially given Corpus Christi. Yeah, and I mean, I think a big part of also being a Church of England church and the kind of convening power that the Church of England has means that we can do things like, develop food co-op projects with our neighbors, or we've got this like pet food mutual aid project going on in our church hall at the moment, and our spaces are often hired for arts groups that then sometimes we wind up working with the artists and the musicians. So I think, yeah, our way of doing faith in action is quite broad and quite generous, but yeah, it provides a lot of ways into church life.
Yeah, amazing. So I think that links very well into us talking about your book, Sacred Pavements, which I picked it up probably about a year and a half ago now that I picked it up, and I have to say, I loved it. I really did, because I think it forced me to. It was around the time when I was just moving to York, and I was starting to explore it. And I mean, of course, it's not as urban as a place like London, but I think it allowed me to really kind of appreciate the surroundings of, spirituality of actually being in an urban space. But I guess it would be great for us to know, what was the inspiration behind you writing this book, and yeah, what led you to, end up with something published?
Well, yeah, I mean, the story I usually tell about it is I had no intentions of writing this book. I wasn't like plotting it out and pitching it around, but I had for many years been very angry, I think, at how in faith circles and kind of broader spirituality circles, so much about what I saw shown as kind of ways to find God was like, go somewhere rural and stand under a beautiful tree and like ponder God's love or ponder the universe. And just, all of these sort of memeable things. It was always about escape. And like, I love a good retreat as much as the next person. Those are really important. And there's a chapter in the book on retreat. But I just, this escapism in faith and spirituality is something a trend I'd sort of noticed for many years and always been really grumpy about. And was chatting to a friend of mine once about this, who is a kind of a new agey pagan. And we were talking in our respective traditions how frustrated we both were with this. And I had been ranting probably for a good 25 minutes about it. And he goes, oh, you have a book in you. You should write that book. And I was like, maybe I will someday. And he went, I'm in publishing. Like, I could hook you up with, one of these kind of hybrid publishers. And I was like, okay, sure, fine, do that, thinking he was just being nice. And he was not just being nice. So I went away and then pitched it to the publisher, and then I had to write the damn thing. But that's where it came from. And it provided me a chance to take a lot of, not just the anger about the escapism, but also, I guess, the kind of toolkit that I developed almost accidentally or in response to living in urban spaces or moving around a lot, as you say. Sometimes you just develop these ways of being and praying and discovering God. And it sort of feels like you have to always do it on your own or on the back foot. And I guess the point of this book was to show people they're not alone. They don't have to always be running away. And yeah, it's possible to share, with each other what we've learned. And that came from.
Amazing.
Yeah, that is really awesome. And I'm actually really excited to hear a bit more about this because, yeah, I really struggle to find any sense of spirituality in urban spaces. I kind of hate being in cities.
Yeah. Yeah, because
So
it's loud and smelly and there's too many people and
yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of a nightmare zone for me.
yeah.
But yeah, so at the beginning of the book, you suggest to your readers that they should plan mini pilgrimages in their cities. Is this something that you do? And like, would you consider it an important part of your faith? I know you've talked a little bit about retreat, but maybe also the concept of pilgrimage.
Yeah, I think for a while I was really deliberate about planning my little pilgrimages. So I try and take a kind of quiet morning or day once a month. I don't always, I suppose I make about 8 or 9 of them a year, shall we say. And part of that is just to have a bit of space to hear my own thoughts, stay away from the inbox. And part of it is sort of, deliberately meant to be spent in prayer. So sometimes I'm really programmatic about it and I go, okay, these are places I want to visit. I'd like to go see, I'd like to go to this church somewhere and hang out there for a while. But sometimes they're much more gut led. I'll just think, okay, I've got a spare hour and a half or 2 hours here where there's nothing booked in and I just need to walk. And I will just trust my feet to lead me somewhere. And sometimes it's just the walking itself, which is the pilgrimage. Sometimes the destination kind of is entirely immaterial. And, there's plenty of wonderful spiritual insights in that. But sometimes I feel very much motivated by I'm going to go see a thing. But I'd say more often these days, it's just about making sure that I'm out and moving. Yeah.
I think that links up really well actually to what I wanted to talk about in the second chapter of the book, where you talk about your, I think fair to say, love-hate relationship with brutalism, and which I think is fair because it's an architectural movement that I think does divide people as well. Some people really, really dig it, and then for other people, they just think it's just this waste of concrete. And I think that's something that I kind of wondered throughout the book is it's how it's sort of negotiating the sort of the eyesores, the bits that when you're walking about and sort of, it's not all beautiful, like you say, in urban cities, they smell and there's lots of people and all those kind of things. So how would you say you kind of navigate that, the kind of the slightly less nice bits of your mini pilgrimages?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in architecture, I think whether that's architecture generally, but brutalism specifically, any specific form of architecture, you find an example of just what we've been talking about so far. The fact that cities divide people, that some people find them incredibly, the energy is brilliant and magnetic and they can meet all sorts of different people. And some people are like running a mile away. So in one way, it's just a concrete example of that more general principle about how people react to urban spaces. I think I used to do a lot of work with folks who I was either spiritually accompanying or, going on pilgrimage with or teaching in some way about God speaks to us through beauty, right? So whether we're in a sacred space or not, wherever we are, whether we're reading a scripture or a poem, let's find what's really beautiful. I guess it's the sort of principle behind Lectio Divina, right? You've got a bit of scripture in front of you and you're sort of looking for what shimmers, what really strikes you as beautiful. And you go, okay, cool, right? That's from God. God has something for me to take in about that in this moment. And then you try and negotiate with God what that is. And I think whilst that is all really well and good, I think that can lead us to think of God, think of our walk with God as something that can only sort of be there, be thriving when we've got a lot of beauty around us, or we got a lot of what we like around us, when life is like kind of going good. Just be like, oh yeah, life's going great. I'm able to see the beauty in everything. Isn't that amazing? And, you know, let's be honest, like life has a lot of not beautiful stuff as well. Life has a lot of, you know, things we find ugly, things we find difficult, pain. You know, there is so much of the shadow to all of the beautiful stuff that we just have to walk with in life. And so I suppose making space for realizing that all of that stuff belongs within the walk of faith, within the spiritual life, rather than sort of using spirituality or faith as a sort of way to leapfrog over the bad stuff. This escapism in another way. So I guess looking at brutalism provides for me, because I do aesthetically like it, but also I see all the issues with it. It provides that kind of space where I can't only just look at something I find beautiful, because I can't just forget all of the other stuff about it, but also I can't just dwell on all the bad stuff, because I also find it quite beautiful. So it's a, you know, quite literally concrete example of those two aspects of life in general, and I think of the spiritual life, you know, together, and doesn't really allow me to get away from either side, which I need.
Whilst you were thinking that, I was thinking actually a lot about how in the UK, we're blessed with so many different types of churches built at different times, and, you know, we have the beautiful medieval ones, but we also have plenty of kind of brutalist, you know, 1960s, 1950s churches, which from the outside and sometimes inside are just really quite grim to look at, you know. But then it is kind of often, I've often found myself being in those kind of churches, and actually after a while, once you kind of just kind of let it settle and move, kind of like you say, go through that pain of, you know, the slightly ugly architecture, you can kind of sit in and realize the beauty in it, because then you realize, you know, how, you know, people have cared for it over the years, and, you know, still shown it a lot of love, and you can start to feel the community that have, you know, built and looked after these churches for all these years as well, which make it just as special as those medieval churches as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think also there's, you know, with brutalism, there's such a sense of like the idealism of it, you know, like we're designing these utopias in the air. And the kind of the ideals of the architects come through really strongly, I think, because of the drastic choices that they made in building and how they're styled. And I suppose being in spaces like that then makes me, or could make one, reflect on what ideals have been put into other buildings. And then how I react to those other buildings changes when I'm in them or around them. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that kind of opens you up, I think, in a really good way.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think hearing you guys talk about sort of brutalist churches from the 1960s is just because I didn't grow up with beautiful medieval churches like Naomi did, and I know you didn't either, Erin. Like I am going to assume that we probably both grew up with a lot of really kind of ugly 1960s A-frame churches with hideous carpeting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The carpet,
so like
the chairs, yeah.
Oh yeah, always.
Yeah.
It's just like, why does every like small town church in North America seemingly have to have the world's ugliest carpet? Why are they all like this?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think hearing the that has made me like brutalism slightly more, because like those are spaces that are objectively hideous, but that I have a lot of emotional attachment to. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think I like brutalism more as a concept now. I'm not sure I actually like it aesthetically.
Yeah. But I mean, one of my favorite books of the Bible is Judges, which one of my biblical professors said should really have the subtitle "Men Behaving Badly," because it is just like it's all of the dudes just getting it wrong, and sometimes quite horrifically wrong, really, really horrible things. And I look at that and I think, oh my gosh, how did this even wind up in scripture, right? Like, it offends me, it offends my morals, it offends my sensitivities, and yet there's something in there for me and for those who approach it as sacred text. And I think, you could say it's a similar thing to approaching architecture that you find offensive on lots of levels. How is this there? Well, it is.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So you also talk in the book about sort of hidden spaces, and finding hidden spaces, and how that can be very exciting, but also sometimes a little bit like discomforting. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of your experience of finding hidden spaces, and how they make you feel when you do find them?
Yeah. One time I sat down with another friend of mine who enjoys Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Neither of us are super obsessed, but we enjoy it. I think we maybe had been having a Hobbit marathon or something like that. And you do the thing where you're like, oh, which Lord of the Rings character do you really feel like is you, on the inside? And I don't remember what my friend said. I think she said one of the hobbits or something like that. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to have to tell her. And she's like, what? Are you going to say something like one of the real heroic characters? And I was like, no, I'm Gollum. And she's like, wait a second, what? You're like a, 6 foot tall American, you could be a shield maiden. And I was like, no, like I feel deeply Gollum-like, because I like swimming, I like fish, I love caves, I like doing funny voices. I like being underground, and I'm like slightly obsessive and have a slightly addictive personality. So I am this character. And apologies for anyone who's watching who does not care about Lord of the Rings. So all that is to say, some part of me has always loved finding hidden things, has always loved subterranean spaces, has always been really, really drawn to them. And I struggle to know entirely why. I think there's something about the stillness of them. I think I find we're talking about specifically kind of subterranean spaces to be spaces where, not unlike a good bit of sacred architecture, you are brought out of whatever you're going through or going into or going around in your everyday life, and you're sort of forced to pause. You're jolted out of your normal. And I think that any hidden space can do that, because if you discover it, first of all, you've got some curiosity kind of whetted in you. But second of all, you feel like you've stumbled upon something that not everybody has access to. And as I reflect a little bit on the book, there will often be reasons, and quite complicated reasons, why not everybody has access to that space. So if you make it past the initial curiosity and, ooh, I found this cool space, then you are forced to grapple with something that can be quite complicated. It requires a little bit of, I don't know, maturity or circumspectness. Circumspection, is that a word? I think that I, as most of us will have had to, at many points during our life, have had to negotiate my relationship to institutional religion and the church and Christianity as things many times in my life. And I think when you have to do that again and again and again, you have to find those kind of liminal spaces, those spaces around the edges of institutions, religions, that you feel comfortable being your sort of weird and wonky self in. And sometimes you feel like you have to, carve those spaces out for yourself. But if you're lucky, you find spaces that have been left behind by other people. So in my case, it's been, brilliant feminist and queer theologians and pioneers who have always existed on the margins of what's acceptable Christianity. And so I think when it comes to the literal urban environment, finding those spaces that are marginal, that are hidden, sort of is a mirror of that searching spiritually that I've had to do as I negotiate and renegotiate my relationship to organized religion and the church.
Yeah.
Awesome. I find it really interesting that you think underground spaces are like, that you find that they sort of help pull you out of your everyday life, because I hate being underground. Like, I hate caves so much. I'm really claustrophobic.
Yeah.
So like for me, they do the exact opposite. And like force me to turn inward in a way that is really uncomfortable for me, because they make me feel really trapped.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think it's really interesting to hear somebody who has such a like profoundly opposite perspective on that.
Yeah. And it's been interesting with some of the feedback that I've had about the book has been either, oh, you really get like the way that I've been trying to do this my whole life, or, oh my gosh, I do not speak your language in any way whatsoever. And there's not been a lot of middle ground. Like, it's been quite polarizing, like all quite, in good faith, good natured. But I've had some fascinating conversations with people who were just like, this could not be farther from my experience whatsoever. And we've had some interesting chats about, the sheer difference of the ways that we relate to place and space and where that comes from in our own backgrounds, which has just been really exciting.
Yeah, it's really cool because I think it's a concept that invites a lot of like conversation, because people do have really strong opinions about spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And have often been told this is how you should relate to certain places or spaces by people in various different kinds of authority around them. But not directly. Often it just kind of seeps in the kind of sides of our cultures until you find yourself going, this is not me at all. How do I work with this? So,
yeah, no, I just to pick up on that, it made me think of I mean, I'm going to be that person and quote your book back to you. I hope that's okay.
Right, I've forgotten everything I wrote by now. So
yeah, but you talk about how to seek out abandoned urban spaces as a spiritual practice is to insist on the value and the virtue of the empty, the melancholy, and the ambiguous. And I think that does make me think sometimes how, but also kind of link what you were saying before about sometimes maybe we just in spiritual spaces, we are often taught maybe more traditional ways that is that you need to seek out, the pilgrim sites, the places are quiet and they need to stay quiet. So maybe it is, when I read that, I kind of felt like, well, maybe it's a similar kind of thing, like when I've been in urban spaces, when I've been like desperately trying to find those quiet, abandoned spaces that no one else knows about, because then that can be my special place. And there is something kind of virtuous about that, actually. It's kind of like, well, this is my, and it just very much like when I was in London, definitely, I was just, it's like, I need to find my quiet spaces that no one else knows about. But the problem is everyone else does know about it because there's so many people.
Well, there's also so many different ways that a place can be quiet or still. You can walk into absolute still, quiet room or building and have such a reaction to it based on something about you or something in your backstory that it can be the opposite of a peaceful space for you to be in. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So I think there's literal quiet, and then there's quiet that extends into, you know, the life of our mind and the life of our spirit. And that's why I think, you know, what calls out to you as some sort of intriguing hidden space that you're able to find yourself stopping in, above ground or below ground.
Mm.
You know, someone else might walk into and be like, I just can't, I got to get out just now.
Mm.
I also think there's something, I mean, I don't know, I'm very extroverted as a person, and this is certainly comes out in how I pray and how I live my spiritual life. And I think the book also is a sort of unintentional, like it's okay to be an extrovert and have a spirituality, you know. And I think sometimes the ability to get and stay still is something which, for those of us who are extroverts, we just got to find whatever works for us, you know, because the ways we've been told it, you know, this is how you do it, might not work because we're always out there.
Well, to go just to pick up on what you said about underground spaces as well, because in the book you make a really interesting link from those kind of underground spaces to the early desert mothers and fathers, the kind of early, well, I'm not sure if monasticism is the right word, but that kind of early spirituality.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, actually.
What I love many things about the desert mothers and fathers. One of the things is how they were all so desperate for quiet, right, that they decided to go to the desert. But then the desert started getting filled with people who were desperate for quiet. So, you know, they started going, oh, I guess we have to meet up sometimes. So, you know, in the desert mothers and fathers, there's pursuit of extremity, extreme asceticism, extreme self-denial as a way of finding literal quiet, right? But of course, if you read them, they're going to find literal quiet away from civilization. But you know, they're understanding what they're doing in that is going to like go battle the devil, right? You know, like so much of the rhetoric is like, I have to be alone because I've got some serious like spiritual battles to fight, you know. And if you read them, you begin to realize they don't think they are alone at all. It's just not living humans who are around them all day, every day. And many of them view their spiritual vocation and their life's vocation as, you know, a sense of doing something that is both of and very much not of the current plane, the current life, but existing on a spiritual plane and very much aided by Christ and by the angels. So, I mean, that's quite fascinating way of thinking about, you know, they sought the hidden, but because they knew they were not going to be alone there, which is fascinating. What's also fascinating is if you get, you know, some of their writings collected and related to you in dribs and drabs, that they were so sarcastic and so snarky with each other. Like, you know, they're trying to write down these, you know, pearls of wisdom that have been gleaned in their silence and their meditation. And in between every other pearl of wisdom, there's something that is just a complaint, and usually a complaint about somebody else, or telling on somebody else, or, you know, and you're like, you're a hermit. When did you encounter all these other people to write stuff about, right? In your like hermit convention, you know? So I guess they understood something it's hard for us with our, you know, phones at hand constantly, to really get, and is that, you know, we're never truly alone, whether we are in the middle of, you know, New York City at rush hour or in the desert. Just the nature of our aloneness is different, and our experience of being surrounded or not being surrounded is different. And I guess I just love that they were so trippy in their understandings of it. It lends such a different perspective to the one I have and we have today. It just, yeah, challenges me a lot.
So would you say you kind of try and tap into that thinking when you are in those underground spaces then?
I wouldn't say so. No, I'm not going to hang out in basements to fight the devil, although I have been asked to do plenty of house blessings along that line. I think, what do I take with me from their spirituality? I try and take their fearlessness with me when I am in hidden spaces, but also, I think some of the wonder, some of the ability to slow down and be in spaces that have maybe been forgotten, and value them for what they are, not what I want them to be. And I think that's what many of the monastics, but especially kind of hermit monastics, teach us, is to love what's right in front of you, no matter how beautiful or unbeautiful you think it is. And that's a lesson I certainly need to kind of relearn every day of my life, is to love what's there, or to at least see what's there with compassion, as much compassion as I have, whether or not I feel I can love it or not.
Yeah, that compassion, I think that also moves quite smoothly onto what the other theme that you explore in the Seeking the Hidden chapter, which is about finding those places which have an uncomfortable history. So you talk about when you've been in Berlin, for example, or places, and even London as well, which have, there are places which are filled with a lot of terror and violence and kind of a lot of darkness to them. So would you say you kind of, how do you kind of navigate those sort of spaces when you're on your pilgrimages through the city?
I think that, well, it's a little bit like what I was saying earlier, in that I try not to treat faith or spirituality as a sort of tool for bypassing the whole of life, or the more difficult things in life. So I try and bring that with me into those spaces. It was interesting, as I was speaking to my colleague here, who was preaching Good Friday for us, who was saying to me that they were going to find it really, really difficult to preach Good Friday because it's such a difficult day. It's so hard. It's death, death, death. It's very sad. And asked if I had any insight. And I found myself saying that, for some folks, Good Friday is going to be the day that they feel that the Christian story most reflects their current experience. People who are in the valley of the shadow, whatever that means for them. And actually, Good Friday and Holy Saturday are days in which you have to look, you don't have to, but the church gives us an opportunity to look the darkness, the sort of worst things that we can do to one another in the face, and to know that we do that not alone, and to know that we are supported in doing that by one another and by kind of the saints and by God. And I suppose that going into hidden spaces that reveal some of the worst that humanity can do to one another, I guess I approach them similarly, with I think a reverence for the pain that has been experienced there and the people who have lived and not managed to live through it. But also, I may be just faffing around Berlin in between seeing my friends and stumbling upon something that's truly horrific. And yet there are people who I know and who I don't know in this world right now, whose lived experience is going to be horrible, truly horrible, as horrific as anything you might find in Berlin. It's a similar, I suppose, way that I would explain why I pray all 150 Psalms. I don't take the ones out that are really violent, or that are clearly meant to be voiced by people who are in the deepest, darkest pain. And sometimes you trundle down to morning prayer and you're like, oh, it's a beautiful morning, I'm feeling great. And you open up the Psalms and it's just like, woe is me, take my life away now, Lord, and kill all my enemies. And you're like, whoa, that's not where I'm at. Yet I trust that in the Psalter, in the 150 Psalms, it really is not about where I'm at that moment, because there will be people in the world who that is exactly where they're at right now. And yeah, I guess those hidden spaces that reveal the darkness, I approach them in a similar way. It doesn't have to be my experience to be valuable in that moment.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about. And I think I quite like that approach to uncomfortable spaces. Um, Earlier, you talked a little bit about sort of being slow and trying to find sort of contemplative spaces, um, as somebody who is like quite extroverted and also quite busy from the sound of things. So what advice would you give for how to sort of slow down, and if any of our members would be interested in doing a mini pilgrimage in their cities, sort of what are your best practices for how to do that, and like, I don't know, not get really distracted and get hit by a car, which is something that I would definitely do.
Well, look both ways before you're crossing the street. I guess, yeah, a few top tips. One would be, it helps me to go to places that I'm unfamiliar with, that I can be, reasonably certain that I'm going to be safe around, but to go places where like everything's new, because then I will be encountering that newness rather than being like, oh, I'm going to go check Instagram now. So turning off your phone and going to new places. I also think for those who feel quite intimidated by the idea of slowing down, it's okay to do like little trials first. So occasionally if I know, gosh, it's going to be really difficult for me to like get out of my like working headspace in order to, go on this walk or go visit the space, then I'll kind of give myself a 5 or 10 minute warm up. In a place that I know, in a place that's, not particularly conducive to anything I'd like it to be, but just sort of give myself that little warm up space, that slowing down space, and force myself to just, literally physically walk around a tiny park at a snail's pace and not care that anybody is looking at me weirdly because it's taking me, 5 minutes to walk a few meters. So I think just physically going incredibly slow and doing that for a short period of time, to warm up to something longer, I think is quite helpful. And I said the thing about, going to entirely new spaces is quite helpful. I think there's potentially also, so for most of my life, I've not been a great journaler. I talk a lot about using a journal in the book to kind of do some of these exercises or to work with, but that is not going to work for everybody. Some people just are like, white pages, too much. But I do think there's something valuable about finding a way to reflect or document what you're doing. If that's a journal, or if that's a scrapbook, or if that's a notes app on your phone, or whatever. I think the sort of the end of the pilgrimage or the end of the walk or whatever, giving yourself space to stop doing what you're doing and just be with what has come up. Acknowledging that what has come up may be quite complex or difficult, and finding a way to document that for yourself. Even if you never look at that again, I think there's something really important about integrating and giving yourself time not to just rush to the next thing that you have to do. So if that's journaling, it's journaling. If not, find a way that makes sense. That would be my other kind of really important tip. And that helps with the slowing down, because if you say this is part of what I'm doing, this kind of like pause and reflect time at the end, that's building in even more slowing down, as it were.
Great. Well, all that's left to say is just thank you for joining us today, Mother Erin. It's been such a delight talking to you and grilling you, as promised. If people want to find out more about you or hear about the book, where's the best places for them to go?
Yes, so probably the best place to find me is on Twitter. I'm on there at E_M_Clark. And I'm a nice Twitter user, so I lurk a little bit, but I don't get into fights because who's got time for that? That's probably the easiest way. I've got a website as well, which is emclark.co, which is very basic. Yeah, if you're in London, come say hi to us here at St Matthew's, Bethnal Green. And if you are desperate to get your hands on a copy of Sacred Pavement, then all your good bookstores will order it. But yeah, you can go to bookshop.org or Waterstones before you give Jeff Bezos your money.
Always a good thing.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And if anyone's listening today wants to hear more about our work at SCM, just go to our website, which is www.movement.org.